See how fast your body changes when their name appears again. Not at the beginning, when everything still felt possible. Not in the middle, when confusion was already exhausting you. At the moment they come back. A message, a reaction, a late hey, a view on your story, a soft apology with no real explanation, a strange little signal that says, I disappeared, but I still exist. And suddenly the whole emotional system lights up again. That reaction is the real beginning of this video. Because Carl Jung would not say ghosting hurts only because someone left. He would say it hurts because they leave without allowing the psyche to complete the experience. The bond is interrupted, not ended. The emotional field stays open. The mind keeps circling. The heart keeps negotiating with absence. Then, just when the silence has started becoming survivable, the person returns like nothing actually happened. That return can feel more destabilizing than the ghosting itself. A real-life example makes this painfully clear. Someone vanishes after weeks or months of closeness. No clear ending. No adult conversation. No naming of what changed. The person left behind spends days replaying messages, scanning for clues, doubting themselves, wondering whether they imagined the intimacy. Then, after enough time passes, they begin slowly rebuilding some inner stability. And right there, just as the wound starts closing, the ghost returns with something tiny. Hey, stranger. Been thinking about you. Hope you're okay. Sometimes not even words, just like a reaction, a small digital touch. The one who was ghosted feels the old attachment reopen immediately. Why? Because ghosting does not produce ordinary grief. It produces suspended grief. Carl Jung would care about that distinction. Ordinary grief, painful as it is, still is form. Something ended. Something is gone. The psyche can mourn, rage, collapse, and slowly reorganize around reality. But ghosting often denies form. It removes the person while preserving uncertainty. It does not say no clearly enough to let the heart stop hoping. It creates an unfinished psychic sentence. And unfinished psychic sentences have power. Jung understood this deeply. What is unresolved continues living in the psyche. It circles, returns, disturbs sleep, colors memory, and keeps seeking completion. A ghosting experience does exactly that. It leaves the ego with no stable meaning. Was it real? Was I used? Did they care? Did I miss something? Was the closeness a lie? The mind keeps trying to complete what the other person refused to complete with honesty. That is why the return feels so intense. The ghost is not just a person reappearing. They are the unfinished question coming back online. When they return, the body does not react only to them. It reacts to the suspended hope, the old confusion, the fantasy of finally getting clarity, the desperate wish that the pain might now make sense. The message does not just say, I'm here. It says, the story is still open, and the psyche is highly vulnerable to open stories. Carl Jung would say the ego often gets trapped less by what is solid than by what is ambiguous. Ambiguity forces psychic activity. The mind has to work. The imagination has to fill gaps. The heart keeps investing because no definitive conclusion has been reached. That is why many people feel more attached after ghosting than they did during the relationship itself. The silence enlarges a person symbolically. Absence becomes fantasy. Mystery becomes emotional weight. Then the return arrives, and all of that weight rushes back into motion. A practical example. Someone who was ghosted tells themselves many stories to survive. Maybe the other person was scared. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe the connection mattered so much they panicked. Maybe they will return when they are ready. These stories do not only protect hope. They protect the ego from the humiliation of meaninglessness. If the disappearance has no noble explanation, then the wound feels colder. So the psyche builds one. This is where the return becomes so dangerous. Because the smallest reappearance can feel like proof that the fantasy was right all along. See? They did think about me. See? It did matter. See? I wasn't crazy. But Carl Jung would ask a much harder question. Does a return bring truth, or does it only reactivate longing? That difference matters more than almost anything. Many ghosters do not return with grounded clarity. They return with fragments, a vague message, a lonely night check-in, a soft emotional breadcrumb, just enough to reopen the emotional field without taking responsibility for the wound they created. And the one who is ghosted often experiences that as a kind of resurrection, not because the connection became real again, because the hope became active again. That is the trap. Ghosting hurts, but the return can be even more addictive because it converts pain back into possibility. The person who left without explanation suddenly seems reachable, warm, maybe even remorseful. The old nervous system reads this as hope, but Jung would warn that hope is not always healing. Sometimes hope is the very force that keeps the psyche imprisoned inside uncertainty. This is why people can feel ashamed of how strongly they react when a ghost returns. They say, "I was doing better." They say, "I don't even know why this matters so much." Jung would say it matters because the original break never became psychologically complete. The return does not simply revive affection. It revives incompletion. It brings the unresolved wound back to the surface and offers the illusion that this time it may finally be answered. That is why the return can feel like fate when it is unresolved psychic tension becoming visible again. And until that becomes conscious, a ghost is never just someone who disappeared. They become an unfinished psychic event with the power to reopen the heart every time they touch the edge of your attention. Carl Jung would say that ghosting becomes psychologically powerful not only because someone disappears, but because a disappearance leaves the psyche without a completed form. That is the key. A person can survive rejection. A person can survive heartbreak. A person can survive a clean ending, even if it hurts deeply. But ghosting does something more disorienting. It removes the other person without allowing the emotional meaning to settle. The relationship does not fully become a relationship, and it does not fully become an ending either. It hovers. It remains unfinished. And for Jung, what remains unfinished acquires unusual psychic force. The psyche does not like open loops. It circles them, returns to them, dreams them, rewrites them, searches them for hidden meaning. That is why ghosting creates such disproportionate attachment. The mind begins trying to complete what reality refused to complete. It starts replaying details, searching for the real explanation, building stories strong enough to hold the rupture. Jung would call this a problem of psychic incompletion. When an emotional event has no symbolic closure, it continues living in the unconscious like an unburied fragment. It keeps asking for form. It keeps asking for interpretation. And the person who is ghosted often becomes trapped in precisely that task. They are no longer only missing someone. They are trying to complete a broken inner pattern. A real-life example makes this easy to recognize. Someone dates a person who feels warm, available, and deeply interested. They share long conversations, private vulnerability, flirtation, maybe sex, maybe the sense that something emotionally real is forming. Then suddenly the person vanishes. No direct explanation. No honest ending. Just silence. At first, shock takes over. Then self-doubt. Then interpretation. Did I say too much? Did I miss a sign? Were they scared? Did they care more than they could handle? Was it all fake? Did I create the meaning in my head? Notice what is happening there. The person who was ghosted is now doing the psychic labor of both people. They are carrying not only their own pain, but the burden of constructing an ending that the other person refused to give. Jung would say that burden becomes powerful precisely because it is infused with projection. Projection matters here more than most people realize. In the absence of truth, the imagination takes over. And imagination rarely stays neutral. If the bond mattered, the absent person quickly becomes larger than life. They stop being only the flawed human who disappeared and start becoming a psychic object full of unresolved meaning. The one who left becomes the keeper of the answer, the holder of the wound, the person whose explanation could finally restore order. This is where the ghost becomes psychologically enlarged. Jung would say that projection grows strongest when there is distance, ambiguity, and emotional charge. All three are present in ghosting. The less direct contact there is, the more room fantasy has to expand. The less explanation there is, the more symbolic meaning gets loaded into the absence. The more pain there is, the more the ego needs a story to mean something. That is why the return feels so intense. The returning ghost is not just a person sending a message. They are the carrier of all the unfinished psychic material that had built up during the silence. Hope, humiliation, fantasy, anger, longing, the wish for repair, the desire for revenge, the craving for clarity. All of it rushes back at once. A simple hey is no longer just hey. It becomes, maybe now I'll understand. Maybe now it was real. Maybe now they'll explain. Maybe now I matter again. Jung would say the ego is especially vulnerable here because ghosting creates a split between reality and fantasy that never fully heals on its own. Reality says, this person abandoned contact. Fantasy says, there must be more to it. The return seems to validate fantasy, even if the message contains almost nothing real. That is the seduction. The ghost does not need to return with substance. They only need to return with enough ambiguity to reactivate the suspended psychic field. This is why breadcrumbing after ghosting can feel almost narcotic. A single emoji, a late-night reaction, a vague check-in can reopen a whole emotional architecture. The body responds before the mind can regain perspective. The old attachment, which had been deprived but not buried, begins living again. Jung would connect this to the complex. A complex is not just a memory. It is an emotionally charged pattern that takes over perception, feeling, and meaning. Ghosting often activates complexes around abandonment, humiliation, not being chosen, being emotionally disposable, loving the unavailable, and needing to earn clarity from someone withholding it. When the person returns, they do not only reactivate present feelings, they constellate the whole complex. That is why the reaction can feel so much bigger than the message deserves. The message is small. The complex is enormous. This is also why people often say, I know I shouldn't care this much, but I do. Jung would respond, of course you do, because the present event is not only present, it is plugged into older psychic material. The return of the ghost does not simply touch one moment. It touches the whole structure of waiting, doubting, hoping, and surviving emotional disappearance. Jung would also point toward the role of redemption fantasy. Many people do not only want the ghost back, they want the story corrected. They want the absence explained in a way that restores their dignity. They want the person who disappeared to return with enough emotional clarity to transform the old wound into something meaningful. That wish is deeply human, but it can become a trap, because the psyche begins seeking not the person, but symbolic repair. And symbolic repair is very easy to project onto a ghost. If they come back and choose me, then the silence meant something. If they explain, then I am not disposable. If they suffer too, then I was not alone in the wound. If they finally see my value, then maybe the abandonment can be undone. Jung would say this is where the person stops relating to the other as they are and starts relating to them as a redeemer object. The ghost becomes the imagined source of restoration. That is why the bond can remain so intense even when the actual behavior remains unstable, vague, and emotionally irresponsible. The returning ghost feels powerful because they are carrying unfinished pain plus projected repair. That combination is psychologically explosive, and until it becomes conscious, the person may keep mistaking the intensity of reactivation for proof that the connection is profound, when very often it's profound only in one specific sense. It is profoundly unfinished. That is the real Jungian structure underneath ghosting and return. Not destiny, not special chemistry, not a cosmic unfinished love story. A psyche trying to complete what was broken without form, and getting rehooked each time the unfinished figure knocks on the door again. Carl Jung would say the real turning point comes when you stop treating the ghost return as a message about destiny and start seeing it as a test of your relationship to the unfinished wound. That is the whole threshold. Because the problem is not only that they came back. The problem is what their return touches in you before you have time to think clearly. A small message appears, and immediately the old architecture starts rebuilding itself. Hope rises. Memory softens. The pain gets reorganized into possibility. The mind begins producing narratives that feel wiser, kinder, and more emotionally generous than the truth you had finally begun accepting during their absence. That is why stopping the cycle requires much more than ignoring a text. It requires consciousness strong enough to interrupt the fantasy before the fantasy becomes reality in your body. A real-life example makes this painfully simple. Someone ghosts you for months. You cried, spiraled, blamed yourself, then slowly began healing. You build a routine again. You stop checking your phone as often. You even began to feel embarrassed that a person who offered so little had taken up so much space in your inner life. Then one evening their name appears. The message is vague, warm, emotionally light, almost innocent. Nothing in it truly repairs a wound. But your body does not care. It reacts first. Adrenaline, focus, hope, a strange rush of relief. Jung would say this is the exact moment the complex is trying to reclaim control. So the first practice is brutally clear. Do not interpret the return from inside the first emotional wave. That wave is not wisdom. It is activation. You may feel longing, tenderness, anger, validation, curiosity, the wish to respond immediately just to stop the tension. But the psyche in that state is not relating to the present message alone. It is relating to months of incompletion, projection, humiliation, fantasy, and old attachment pain. If you interpret from there, you'll almost always end up feeding the same structure again. This is why pause matters more than almost anything. Not a theatrical pause, a psychological one. You see the message, you feel the surge, and instead of asking, "What should I say?" you ask, "What is happening in me right now?" That question changes the center of gravity. Now the ghost is no longer the whole story. Your reaction becomes the story. Jung would want you to name it precisely. Is this love? Or is it nervous system activation? Is this genuine longing for this person as they actually are? Or longing for closure, restoration, and relief from the old wound? Is this a present desire? Or a past complex coming back online? The second step is to answer the return with the pattern, not the moment. This is essential. Ghosts return through fragments. A soft tone, a late apology, a lonely night message, a sign of remembrance. But the psyche is often tempted to treat the fragment as if it cancels the whole history. Jung would say that is how unconscious repetition survives. The ego seizes on the exception and ignores the structure. So when the ghost returns, the right question is not, "How does this message make me feel?" The deeper question is, what has the total pattern always done to me? Did this person offer clarity? Did they take responsibility? Did they stay present when things became emotionally real? Did they disappear instead of ending honestly? Did they return with substance, or only with symbolic contact? Truth lives in the pattern. Fantasy lives in the fragment. That sentence alone can protect a life. The third step is harder. You must grieve the fact that the return does not mean what the wounded party wants it to mean. This is where many people fail themselves. They know the message is weak. They know the person has not changed in any visible way. But the childlike or wounded part inside says, "At least I matter enough for them to come back." Jung would say that part deserves compassion, but not leadership, because the desire to matter can make very little feel enormous. The returning ghost can seem emotionally significant not because they are truly choosing you, but because your wound around abandonment is starving for any sign that the story was not pure disposability. That hunger is real, but it must not run the interpretation. So the grief becomes, this message may soothe the wound for 10 minutes, but it does not repair what their pattern created. It may reactivate hope, but hope is not the same as honesty. It may prove they still think of me, but being remembered is not the same as being chosen. Jung would say this is one of the deepest acts of self-respect and love, refusing to let symbolic crumbs define emotional reality. The fourth step is reclaiming the projection. What exactly had you been asking this person to give you psychically? Worth? Closure? The final proof that you were unforgettable? A reversal of humiliation? An ending that restored dignity? If you do not name that projected need, the ghosts will keep carrying too much power. Their return will always feel bigger than it is because they are holding something that belongs inwardly to you. Once you name it, you can begin taking it back. If what you wanted was dignity, build dignity without waiting for their explanation. If what you wanted was proof that you mattered, stop placing that proof in the hands of someone whose pattern was disappearance. If what you wanted was closure, begin accepting that closure is often an inner act, not a gift from the one who wounded you. Jung would insist on this. What remained projected remains powerful. What is reclaimed begins to lose its enchantment. Finally, you must allow the silence after not responding, or after responding differently, to reveal what was always underneath. This is the part many people avoid. If you do not re-enter the cycle, there may be grief, emptiness, even a strange deadness at first. That does not mean you made the wrong choice. It means the old loop is not being fed. The psyche has to learn how to live without the activation, and that learning can feel like withdrawal. But withdrawal is not the same as loss of soul. Sometimes it is the beginning of getting your soul back. Carl Jung would say the work here is not to become cold. It is to become conscious enough that the ghost no longer has access to the unfinished places in you without your awareness. Once that happens, the return changes meaning. It is no longer destiny. It is information. It tells you what still aches, what still hopes, what still wants to be chosen by someone who already taught you what their pattern is. And from there, a different kind of love becomes possible. Not the love that survives on interruption, ambiguity, and symbolic reentry. The love that can finally recognize that a person returning is not the same thing as a person arriving for real. That is how the wound stops reopening. Not because the ghost never comes back, because you are no longer living with the door inside you unlocked by fantasy. Carl Jung would say the deepest pain in ghosting is not only that someone disappears, it is that they disappear without allowing the psyche to finish the experience. That is why the return hits so hard, not because the message is always meaningful, not because the bond was always profound, not because destiny is knocking. Very often, it is because the wound was never given shape, and the returning ghost touches that unfinished place with just enough warmth to make the whole structure come alive again. That is the real heartbreak. You are not only reacting to them, you are reacting to interruption, to suspended grief, to the old fantasy that maybe this time the silence will finally make sense. Carl Jung understood that what remains unfinished continues living in the psyche with unusual force. It keeps asking for form, asking for closure, asking for meaning. That is why ghosting can feel stronger after the fact than during the connection itself. The imagination enlarges what reality refused to complete. Then one message, one breadcrumb, one small signal can make the entire inner world reopen. And that is where so many people get trapped. They mistake reactivation for truth. They mistake adrenaline for love. They mistake a return for a choice. But return is not always a choice. Sometimes it is only unfinished access. Sometimes the other person is not coming back because they are ready to love clearly. Sometimes they are coming back because your emotional availability still exists in their mind as something reachable, something comforting, something unfinished for them too. That can feel intimate. It can feel faded. It can feel like proof that the story is not over. But Jung would ask the harder question. What has the pattern actually shown you? Because the pattern matters more than the reappearance. The pattern tells you who they become when intimacy asks for structure. The pattern tells you what they do instead of ending honestly. The pattern tells you whether they return with responsibility or only with emotional disturbance. That is the difference you have to protect. Before we close, sit with one direct question. When they came back, what did you hope it would finally repair in you? The humiliation? The confusion? The fear that you did not matter? The old wound of not being chosen clearly? Stay with that answer, because that is the real attachment point. Not only the person, the repair fantasy. And once you see that clearly, you begin taking your power back. You stop waiting for the ghost to become the one who heals the wound they helped create. You stop asking a fragment to become a future. You stop letting ambiguity keep its sacred status in your heart. If this resonates, write in the comments one thing you now understand differently about why ghosting hurts so much when they return. And if you know someone who keeps getting pulled back in every time a ghost reappears, share this video with them. Because sometimes the most important truth is this. They did not always come back because love was real. Sometimes they came back because the door was never fully closed, and the unfinished part of you still hoped they would be the one to finally close it with care. Carl Jung would say healing begins the moment you stop asking the ghost to give you the form they already refuse to offer. And that is when the wound can finally stop living on borrowed hope